Hey everyone, hope you're doing okay this evening. I'm excited about this because not only am I passionate about the subject, but I think for you tonight, regardless of how this develops, you're going to learn quite a bit about a fascinating story that you probably have never heard of before. And I want to try to contextualize the time period here. I have in my hand here, this is a book. We have a collection of rare texts and manuscripts. This book is from 1609. I don't expect you to read it, but I just wanted to show you that I have it. So this is a book from 1609 that has the rule and Testament of Francis of Assisi in Latin and also Spanish. And it has any number of documents in it, which also include, once again, I don't know how easy this is to see, but this is a section that is made for the friars who are going to the Indias. So the book that I have in my hand would have been the book that friars would have had at chapter meetings, which means this book or something similar to that would have been here in St. Augustine in the period that we're going to be talking about. And let me contextualize that period, especially for those of you thinking in terms of California history. I have a couple dates here. The Spanish established the settlement of St. Augustine in 1565. In 1573, Franciscans arrived here, and the first mission was already going a couple of years later. Our Lady of the Good Birth, as she's called. We'll talk about that later. The friars left in 1763 when the Spanish ceded Florida to the British to get Havana back after a war. The friars in California arrived in 1769. So what that means is obvious. We're in a different period of time. Friars were leaving Florida after almost 200 years when they arrived in California. So we're talking about a really different period of Franciscan history. Essentially, the first friars who come, they're still medieval in many ways. And one of the delights that I have as a scholar of Franciscan studies is realizing all that medieval stuff that I've been studying over the years. Now I can actually use it to study these documents from Florida in these different languages. So I'm here at Flagler College. The architecture may resemble something that you're familiar with. Once again, the city is very much influenced by Spanish colonial culture. And here with a very interesting twist of Islamic influence as well on the architecture. So this is what I see every day when I come to work. And I can tell you 27 years, it never gets older than it already is, right? So here's the presentation that I'm going to give you tonight. Like I said, I can imagine that there would be some questions because this is, in a sense, coming out of nowhere for many people. Quite frankly, here in the United States, people don't know anything really about St. Augustine, the Spanish history, the fact that by the time St. Augustine had a settlement with grandchildren, that's when the Puritans arrived. We were already going under, we had urban renewal going on here in St. Augustine when the British showed up. So we're talking about an early period in our history that I'm so happy to present to you. So here's the overview of what we're going to do. These are the points that I'm going to try to develop. And like I said, this is new. There's quite a bit of material too, so I can understand if people maybe get lost in this. But I do want to keep moving through, and then I can very easily go back to what people may want to talk about. We're going to be talking about missionaries, of course, in language, and I just have a couple of cautionary tales that I would remind Franciscan scholars of. You may have heard the story when Friar Jordan and the friars went to Germany, coming out of Italy. They got to the border with Germany, and they were met by people who did not speak Italian. The friars didn't speak German, and so they said, "Are you?" They asked in German, "Are you friars?" And they said, "Yeah." They said then, "Are you heretics?" "Yeah," because the only word that they knew in German was "yeah." And so they ended up being rounded up, stripped naked, made to dance around as heretics because they were thought to be there to corrupt the faith and sent back to Italy. Language is important in evangelization. If you ever read Friar William's account of when he went to Asia, and along the way he had an interpreter, and one of the big frustrations he had with language was the interpreter would always get drunk and would never really get across the message, and he didn't know what the Chinese were hearing for sure ever. Once again, the problem of language and missionization. Final person is one of my favorites in the Franciscan story, and that's Roger Bacon. Roger Bacon wanted an incredibly revolutionary change in the curriculum in the Middle Ages, focusing on language study. And he said one of the most important things that we have to understand is that we have to study other languages to proclaim the gospel. And he reminded people, which I've often told students, that he did not think Latin was very important per se, because God has never revealed God's self through Latin. It's been in Arabic, it's been in Greek, it's been in Chaldean, but God has never spoken to us through Latin. So Latin's important, but don't get carried away with that. You need to learn the ancient language in addition to contemporary languages so you can preach. Okay. So here's these ground zero, if you will, of the presentation that I'm giving tonight, and that is the city of St. Augustine. And you can see it here. This is right at the time when the Spaniards are leaving. You can see it's quite well developed, but it's a very small settlement, and it is incredibly, if you will, interracial. People don't understand. If you ever get a chance, watch a movie on PBS called The Secrets of Spanish Florida, and you'll realize that the story of America, in North America, what we call today in the United States, starts in St. Augustine, and it starts with diversity. It's only later in history do we move away from diversity, but the very beginnings of this settlement in Florida was Africans, Spaniards, indigenous peoples, scattering of Catholics from places like Ireland. It was diverse from the very beginning. And that diversity is something that's going to then elicit from the friars a deeper commitment to preaching and language studies. First thing, so we want to contextualize different sections of this presentation. Like I said, it's a lot, but first of all, I want to just bring to your attention the indigenous maternal landscape of this area, which was inhabited primarily by the Timucua Indians. When the Spaniards arrived here, it is rather funny when you read their accounts, because they came as conquistadors with swords and they wanted to fight other men. And when they arrived here in Florida, they came to realize very quickly that often women were in charge of the villages. Not only did they have to now deal with women and whatever problems they thought that might create, but the people were also taller than them. So these short conquistadors show up, and they're now finding themselves dealing with women, and this begins to really change Franciscan ministry, as I'm going to try to show later, this contact with the maternal background. Timucua culture was matrilineal, which means that power passes through the women. So the women's role was also always crucial. And they also had what some people today would maybe refer to as a third gender. This is found in any number of indigenous cultures. These were men who took on female tasks. They got the name Verdace, which comes from French, and it's really a slur. It's not a good word, but this is what shows up in the sources. We would call them, if you were reading indigenous studies today, two spirits. So this is the kind of dynamic that you're finding right away. Let's dive in a little bit more into the maternal background and now look at the colonial. So you have the Native American sort of basis, right? The maternal culture. And then when we look at the female population, these statistics are sort of rudimentary in their initial. We're still working through. We actually have the baptismal records going back all the way to 1593. So we can see in the baptismal records the ethnic background, gender, etc. And we see that baptismal records from this period show just a broad range of different ethnic groups, and particularly all different a female population that's incredibly diverse. So this is where people are doing ministry, right? This is you're in a maternal culture where there are sizable, powerful body of women with various backgrounds. And it's not surprising then that when we look at the ecclesial culture, we see the churches that are being founded are named one after another after Mary. So you have Our Lady of the Remedios. You have Our Lady of Solitude. The St. Francis Barracks, which was the convent of the friars, that was named after the Immaculate Conception. And the beautiful painting, in my eyes, the beautiful painting that you're looking at in the center of the screen is the Our Lady of the Milk and Good Birth, which was, imagine this, at a Timucua shrine, an image like this. This was a replication that my wife and I came across in Campeche, Mexico. Matter of fact, many of the Timucuans and others, when they left Florida, went to Campeche. And the feminine dimension is even further enhanced if you look at the later foundation of what is called, if you look it up, Fort Mose was the first free Black settlement in the United States. What happened is slavery, as I tell my students, is always slavery. But you have to notice the difference between Spanish law and English law when it comes to this. And so word had gotten out in the British colonies that if you escaped and got to Florida, you would get your freedom. So what happened, many people went on incredibly arduous journeys. And so we like to joke about the fact that the Underground Railroad actually first went south. These were people trying to get out from under the British oppression. And they would, if they made it to St. Augustine and they became Catholic, they could then stay there at this fort, which became a crucial dimension of St. Augustine's defensive system. And I would note that it was actually Fort Mose de Santa Teresa de Avila. It was named after Saint Teresa, who had not been canonized that long ago. So to have this contemporary woman now set up as a leader, once again, enhances that maternal dynamic that is here in this area. So you notice this coin was found not too long ago. And one of the archaeologists sent me pictures of it. He said, obviously I can see Mary on the left, but what's on the right? And I said, that's Teresa of Avila. So this was found in a village probably dating to around the 1630s. Somebody had a medal of her. Now we're going to switch. So we've got the maternal background at different levels. Now I'm going to go into the theological idea that, if you will, engages with this culture. We talk about eroticism in God in the theology, especially of someone like Pseudo Dionysius. So Dionysius was noted for saying, if you talk about agape, philos, and eros, God's not primarily agape, God is eros. And for him then, the idea of eros is to be drawn outside of yourself, to be ecstatic, right? To stand outside of yourself. So God's own being is ecstatic, and God comes out of God in the incarnation. So the incarnation now becomes an erotic event. The incarnation has an eroticism to it because it's based on desire. Okay? God doesn't come because of a rule or a law, but because of desire that overflows into the material world. So in a very hierarchical way, Francisco Pareja, when he's talking to ministers, is going to say, you have to understand how this hierarchy works. You have God who comes out of God's self, descends in the flesh of Jesus of Nazareth, and then that spirit goes out to you ministers, and in a very patriarchal way, you have to take that position of the Father. Okay, so just notice this. But think about that dynamic in a maternal context. So you've got a very strong erotic paternal idea here. And this is what the friars have been studying in Spain. And this was the big challenge for many of the friars. They studied scholastic theology, and they got in the Americas and they said, what does this theology mean? Does it mean anything here at all? all this training, what do we do here in this world? So he takes this idea, I think it's really quite creative, takes the idea of Dionysus, God's love coming out of God, comes into the subordinate, but then watch what happens. God comes out of God's self, becomes a servant, but then what Pareja says is, yeah, you have to take on the paternal, if you will, role, but you really have to change your gender to a certain degree if you're going to be a minister. And he quotes Paul here saying, we are free. And of course, we're neither male nor female. So that all that power that descends from God, it's not going to go anywhere into ministry unless you take on a maternal dynamic in your ministry. So here's a text. I won't read it through. I'll just let you look at it for a moment. And you can see where he's saying you have to take on a maternal perspective and approach if you're going to minister. And you can see how he just moved through this test. And I love this. This is the reason a boy becomes a girl. This is why we're changing here, because we're not going to be effective ministers if we don't. I find this really quite stunning for a number of different reasons. If the first being just the sensitivity to the maternal culture, then turning to theology to find a way to engage that culture, and then calling on the friars themselves to now take on this maternal in a maternal cultural context. In the background for the friars, the image of Mary that is really powerful here is out of the book of Revelation. Why? Because you may remember this is the Mary clothed in the sun with the baby who's coming. It's an apocalyptic image. So as he talks to the friars about becoming maternal, he says, this is our model. The woman clothed with the sun, that incredible expectation that she has to bring Christ into the world, we should have that same dynamic in our lives, that we're just eager to bring that Christ to the forefront. All right, now we're moving to the third section. We've done the maternal background. We've done the sort of the key theological idea that's powering this ministry. Now we want to focus more particularly on the question of texts and literacy. Missionaries in Peru, in the Philippines, in Mexico, in Florida, were all focused on literacy. What's happening is we're moving into the early modern period, and literacy and the classics, thanks to Erasmus and others, are going to be very important. So language acquisition is going to be a sine qua non for missionaries, and we'll find ministers general, popes, kings and queens, everyone writing, you have got to learn that language if you're going to work with those people. So on the left-hand side, you see this is an image in one of the Timucua books here. And this is a wood print coming originally from Mexico. You can tell that because if you look in the corners, you'll see columns. Churches don't have columns in Florida like this. Everything's wood here. So this is an image from Mexico, but you can see the students studying with the friar. Books in hand, coming up, reciting, going back. And this, by the way, is at the same time when a lot of kids in Europe, in big cities, are just learning by memorization and they have no books. We already are having books in the 1500s. And we're also having Mexican students who are studying philosophy and logic and writing in Latin. Acquisition of the word, Franciscans have always had a fascination with the word, be it Jesus, be it the written word. It's been called by one Italian scholar the religion of the book. You would think that that wouldn't be a big thing, but it is very, very important. So literacy is a goal. Notice the map then on the right. You can see on the bottom there it says una non sufficit orbis. One world does not suffice. And remember, this was the complaint of Alexander the Great when he asked how many worlds are there, and his mentor said only one. He said, well, that's a shame. Only one world to conquer. So they're playing off that classical theme here, and you can see now the second world is being presented to Francis, and that's the Americas. By the way, when they go to the Americas, they hit a linguistic wall. When friars would go to, let's say, Africa, Asia, they would encounter people who spoke Latin, Greek. They would have people with them that spoke Arabic. When they reached the Americas, they had a linguistic wall. We have nobody who knows these languages. And there's a lot of languages. There are a lot of languages. And you have to maybe feel sorry a little bit for the missionaries who thought that they were bringing about the end of the world by their preaching because they believed once the whole world had heard the word, Christ would come back. But then when they realized that the world is a lot bigger and all these languages, it does present a real challenge to the morale. Let's put it that way, of some. Like, how do we do this? How do we do this? So the person that draws my attention and others right now, especially here in Florida, is a friar by the name of Francisco Pareja, who is from Spain. We think that he very well might have actually gone to Mexico to work before going to Florida, and this is where he learned the expertise in working with indigenous writers in the production process. There's already now, for some 20 years, a printing press in Mexico City. And they're using Mexico City because the printers back in Spain can't handle the indigenous script. They don't know what to do with it. And so when they try to do a book in Spain, it comes out as a disaster. So there's a large pool of indigenous translators in Mexico City working on these texts. And here, should you ever get that way and stop by this little village, there's one Airbnb there, which is quite nice. There's a stunningly beautiful medieval church there that, thanks be to God, in my universe, escaped the Baroque. And so you can walk into it and it's just a stellar, simple place. So what does Pareja come into? He comes into a situation, as I mentioned, the friars are here starting to come in 1570s. You can see the extent of the missions here in the southeast. The blue ones, of course, are the earlier ones, and you can see how they were testing, kind of going to different places all along the eastern seaboard, which Spain then claimed. But then later they begin to focus in that area that we're in here, St. Augustine, and in particular where you see St. Augustine, and then north of there you see Mocama. I hope you can catch that. That is the dialect of Timucua that Pareja is going to be working with. So that, just like many languages, Timucua itself has a number of different dialects. So the title of my talk came from a text that I ran across when reading through Pareja's work. And this is what's called an arte, okay? Missionaries would do this in Mexico, in Peru, in Costa Rica, different places. They would come up with an arte which would help the missionaries learn the language. And so in this one here, the whole prologue by Pareja expresses that sort of idea of Roger Bacon, that you have to learn the languages and you have to know how to speak and preach in those languages in a clear way. Because if you don't learn the languages, your sermons are going to be awful. And who knows what's going to happen when you try to hear a confession. And so there's problems in that area, as you can imagine. This is an early map of the area that's not far from where I live. It's where Mission Nombre de Dios, where Our Lady of the Good Birth, that her shrine is there. This gives you an idea of the little villages that the Spanish found along the coast here. And I want to really underscore this point. Florida doesn't have missions like in the Southwest where people would be gathered together. What would happen is a friar would be brought out, sometimes with a soldier, into an individual village, and with the agreement of the chief, would be dropped off there. So you have individual friars pretty much within a day's walk of each other from the Georgia South Coast to the northern Florida coast. So they go native really quickly, right? So they're dropped off, and now what do if they don't speak the language? So we have a period of the 1570s until the early 1600s where they're trying to learn the language, and how this happens in linguistic exchanges is you typically start with children. So if you don't know a language, you start with the child, and there's a couple of reasons for that, right? Children's language is not quite as complex usually. And also, when a child laughs at you when you try to pronounce a word, it's a lot different than when an adult laughs. I'm telling you that from experience, right? So they start to meet and they start to develop word lists. And the word lists are very simple. This has happened all throughout the Americas. So Friar would sit down with a girl or a boy, they're educating both genders, and would point to water and say agua. And the Timucua person would say ibine. So they start to develop word lists. And then gradually from the word list, they start to construct simple faith statements. As the language is being developed and those texts get more complex, at a certain point in time, Pareja is going to take them to Mexico City and publish them as books. One of the really sad points, has anybody seen that movie, The Name of the Rose, or read the book? You may remember the horrible scene when the library is being burned. Makes people like me just want to cry. I mean, you burn a book, you burn a memory, you burn a life. And what happened here is the British burned the library. And not only was it stocked with regular theological fare, one observer said they had the fathers of the church there. Imagine all the manuscripts in indigenous languages, because the friars were teaching and preaching in Apalachee, Timucua, and Wale, 3 indigenous languages. We only have one left document in Apalachee, nothing yet in Wale, although it's said that there is one. So this is the context, right? You see this village here, this is how this would happen. In the middle, you can see the big lodge, which was typically the chief's house. Houses are gathered around this. Good to remember also that the Spanish never conquered Florida. The whole almost 200 years was contested, resistance, confrontation, warfare, reconciliation, in particular, not just with the indigenous populations, but the British really wanted the Spanish out of Florida for no other reason, is because they allowed slaves to become free. And the sad story about Florida in American history is that when Florida became an American state, the Americans insisted that Spanish law be abolished so that people could be put in slavery again. When a Franciscan came to visit the friars, this is what he reported. Now, Audrey was Peruvian. He was a Creole. And he himself spoke several different languages. And he became the visitor from Italy, from Spain, that was sent over when this area became a province. It became the province of St. Helen, Santa Elena. This is what he reported. He's walking around in the village and he's seeing all these Indians with books. Now, of course, he would be the kind of person, a literary person, who would notice this. Think about this. Kids, boys and girls, are learning to read and write in what will become the United States in the late 1500s. They're learning to write in their own language. Now, Timucua was not written, so what they did is the friars gave Latin letters to the sounds that they heard, and then developed the language in that way. How important was literacy? This is a text that really jumped out at me. It's on baptism, and they're saying, they're talking about, how do we know baptism? How do we know this work? And they're saying, well, you have to have faith that the grace will come. And they said, well, how do we have faith in what we can't see? And they say, well, look at this. You're learning your ABCs. You believe that A means this. You believe that B means this. You believe that C means that. You're making an act of faith when you're becoming literate. So by way of an analogy, That's what's happening in baptism. So think about this. They're talking about baptism within a culture that's just learning how to read and write. And so they're really applying very clear pastoral initiatives here, trying to tie what's happening in the church on a number of different levels. I'll go back and look at this text again. Notice on the right-hand side and the left-hand side, the Latin is a little different. What struck me about this is then it made me wonder if the Timucua editors, now is the point where we introduce the editors. We always had this idea, some of us, shouldn't say everybody, but many of us had this idea, Father's real smart, he comes to the New World, he learns the languages, he writes books, and then he translates them into the language of others. Not like that at all. What happened was the Spanish are writing and they're working with co-editors in Timucua, and they're giving the text to the Timucua to put into their language, and then they're working back and forth in agreement about what's being said and what can be said and what can't be said. When a person like myself comes across a different Latin quote from the scripture in the Timucua, that suggests that maybe the Timucua person has their own scripture that they like, and they've decided to gloss it here a bit out of their own experience. For nerds like me, this is like really cool. Like what is going on here? So what emerges from this is a literary production that would be the envy of anyone's CV. You can look at this and in a very short time, between 1612 and 1628, look at all the texts that have been produced out of a small, very small Christian Spanish indigenous community. The last one I'll mention later, but I'll start with the first ones here. And another thing that people like us would want to watch is the publications trace the trajectory of the Christian life. So the first publication has the presentation of the faith. The second publication deals with baptism. Another one deals with confession. Then the later one with communion. And then finally, in a really fascinating text, how to go to Mass. So you can trace the evangelical message going through Florida by the publications and where the community is at that time. These are some of the other ones. This Segunda Parte, this one on the right, this is the one that I took to use for that text from Pseudo Dionysius. And then the last one here, I'm going to dwell on this. There's actually two other Timucua texts, Spanish-Timucua by another author, but we're going to focus just on Pareja now. This last one has to do, those of you who are familiar with Spanish can see that it is, what is the way that you listen to the Mass and its ceremonies? How do you do this? This is an incredible text, okay? Not because I found it, but I did find it on my sabbatical. And what is so cool for me, and this is my wife, she just retired Spanish professor. We had no idea that it existed. We had absolutely no idea that it existed. It's not referenced in any other works. Long story on how that was discovered. We don't have any time for that. But it was essentially a moment where I looked to heaven and said, Lord, if you want to take me, I mean, if there's got to be a point where I step out, this would be really a good one, because this not only was it exciting for me, but for my colleague who works with Timucua was a big find because he has a database that he works with, so he's adding in more Timucua words all the time. So thanks to this discovery, he has a much better insight, for example, on Timucua numbers, because there's a whole section on the Stations of the Cross, which is quite fascinating. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll kind of move around here, but the last thing I wanted to do is look at what's called the Confessionario. And the Confessionario is filled with what we call Exempla, which are stories. Those in medieval studies know about Exempla, stories used in preaching. Well, those Exempla, if you will, migrate to the Americas get translated into Spanish and then into Timucua. And let me just highlight, by the way, here's the table of contents from the confessional or the book for confession. And notice here on the right side, there's a small confessional. What that is it's a shorter version, was probably the original one that they would carry in the field. And then later they built out around that into a larger book. Working with my colleague at the University of Florida, we can see differences in the text. There's some real differences between the Timucua and Spanish. You'll notice in this example here, references, for example, to the devil or the demon don't appear. And that's a question that we could pursue if you want to later. But you'll notice that there's some real differences in the translations, some real differences. And so my students, when we do translations of this, they're really good at just like, I say, well, what's the difference? And they find it really quickly. And then I say, well, what do you think? Why do you think that they're different? Why do you think that they're different? So here's one of my favorite ones, and we'll end up with this. Yes, the devil does speak out of his rear end. That's the image that we're seeing here. And this is a famous story of Augustine. And by the way, to give you an idea of how prudish we are compared to our, if you will, forerunners, this was an altarpiece in a church. Okay. So we're talking about quite a different world. I have the Latin text here. Okay, then I'm going to walk you through real quick. If we had time, we could get into this more deeply. But on the left hand, you have the translation of the Spanish into English. And then on the right hand, you have the translation from Timucua into English. And there's some pretty big differences here. One that jumps out, and I've found this time and time again, is the Timucua do not agree with the Spanish in representing evil by a snake. So time and time again, where the Spanish will revert to the story of the garden and the snake, they will not talk about the devil as a snake. And if you live in Florida, you know that there be snakes, okay? There be snakes. But you also learn pretty quickly that there are good snakes and bad snakes. If you see a black snake in your yard, you're happy because they eat poisonous snakes. So the Timucua know that it's impossible to say that pure evil is a snake. So they refuse to put that into their text. Now, the Spanish can see clearly, they know enough to see that the snake's not in there. So there's a negotiation that goes on between cultures here. Like, do you have to put that in or not? And clearly the Spanish say, no, that's not the center of the story. So you don't have to do that. And plus we understand it doesn't make any sense in your culture anyways. So the text that I talked about with Pseudo-Dionysius, it starts with this. The reminder from Isaiah that the word should go out and not come back empty. And I would like to confirm that by pointing out, first of all, that we just heard from the Vatican that the what are called the Georgia martyrs have now been approved for canonization. So the word has not come back, especially from a Catholic ecclesial theological perspective. The word is coming back just with incredibly strong echoes over the centuries that was preached here so early. But also, the cause for Florida martyrs is now in the Vatican. And if they approve the Georgia martyrs, we think we're going to get the Florida martyrs approved because our story is so much better. There's so many more of them. And what's particularly important for us, many of the martyrs are indigenous Christians. Okay, so this is not just Spaniards, it's not just priests. So that cause is actually named after Antonia Inija, who was a very famous Apalachee chief who was respected, spoke Spanish. They said that he played guitar at the liturgy with that Spanish style. So we've been able to present these different people to Rome, and my dream is to go to St. Peter's. And if you've ever been in a canonization, you'll see that they drop down these incredibly big banners over St. Peter's. I live for the day when I see Floridians indigenous Floridians dropping. That is going to be a great day. And that's it, folks. There's, like I said, this is a kind of a real quick run through, but I hope you can tell I love telling the story. I mean, it's an incredible story. And I'm, I'm 71 years old, and I feel like I'm 15. I feel like someone strapped a rocket to my back and lit it, because here in this area of the country, people are just so fascinated about this. You can give talks all the time